To the Manor Born is the reason a Georgian house in Somerset still gets coach parties. On the 28th of July this year, the people of a Surrey village called Milford came out and stood along the pavement in the sunshine and waited and went quiet as a hearse came through. They were saying goodbye to Dame Penelope Keith, who had died a month before at 86 and who had lived among them for over 50 years. She was the last of them. Every person you are about to meet has now gone, and the story behind this programme is a good deal stranger than the programme ever let on. Penelope Keith has to come first, because for 2 years she held 20 million people in the palm of her hand every Sunday evening. She played Audrey Forbes-Hamilton, the widow who has just buried her husband, discovered that he left nothing but debts and must sell the manor house her family had held for 400 years, and then move into the little lodge at the end of the drive and watch another man live in it. That is a wonderful joke. And it only works if the actress can do two things at once. Audrey had to be insufferable. She corrects people. She arrives uninvited. She tells a self-made millionaire how his own kitchen ought to be run and which of his own trees need felling. And underneath every line of it, you had to be able to see a frightened woman who has lost her husband and her home in the same month and has no idea in the world how to say so out loud. Keith did both, inside the same sentence, over and over again, for 20 episodes. That is why you loved her instead of resenting her. Here is what almost nobody watching knew. She was born in April 1940 and christened Penelope Ann Constance Hatfield. Her father was an army major, and he walked out on the family when she was a baby. She grew up in Clacton-on-Sea and then in South London with her mother, and in time she took her stepfather's surname. The grandest woman on British television came from nothing remotely like a manor house. She very nearly did not get into the profession at all. The Central School turned her down, and the reason they gave was her height. She was 5'10", and they could not imagine who she would play. So she went to the Webber Douglas Academy instead and paid her way by working evenings at the Hyde Park Hotel, which meant that at 19 she was standing a few feet from exactly the sort of people she would spend the next 50 years gently taking apart. She watched them closely. You can see every hour of that homework in Audrey. Then came the thing that made her. In 1975, she was cast as Margot Leadbetter in The Good Life, the magnificent, terrifying woman next door, and the nation took her to its heart in about 4 weeks. She won a BAFTA for it. She won a second BAFTA the year after that for a Tom Stoppard adaptation. She won an Olivier Award on stage for a play called Donkey's Years. And in June 1978, The Good Life did something no British sitcom had done. Its final episode was recorded as a Royal Command performance in front of the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, with the cast presented to them afterwards. 18 months later, she was at Cricket St Thomas in Somerset in a headscarf, and the numbers went somewhere no comedy has been since. The end of the first series of To the Manor Born was watched by nearly 24 million people, at the time the largest audience for anything on British television that was not a live event. The last episode of all in 1981 still pulled 17.5 million. What she did with the rest of her life is the part I admire most. She married a policeman, Rodney Timpson, in 1978 and stayed married to him. They adopted 2 brothers in 1988. She kept the same house in the same Surrey village for half a century and refused absolutely to live the life of a celebrity. And for 32 years, she ran the Actors Benevolent Fund, taking over as president from Laurence Olivier, which means 3 decades of quietly finding money for actors who had run out of work, or health, or luck. She was made a dame in 2014 for services to the arts and to charity, and the charity half of that was not decoration. In her 70s and 80s, she found a final career that fitted her perfectly. She walked around English villages, canals and country houses on television and told you about them without a script full of jokes, simply because she loved them. And she was still doing it this year for Channel 4. There were other sitcoms in between, 6 of them, and she led every one. Executive Stress in the 80s, Next of Kin in the 90s, and she went back to the stage whenever she could, playing Lady Bracknell in her late 60s, which is a part she had been rehearsing, in a sense, since 1975. Dame Penelope Keith died at home in Surrey on the 29th of June this year, living with cancer, aged 86. Hundreds of her neighbours came out for the funeral you saw at the start of this video. Not a film crew in sight, just a village. Penelope Keith spent 50 years playing women who owned everything, and she came from a home her father had walked out of and left with nothing. The man who bought her house from her had a secret in his own family that makes the whole programme funnier than anybody intended. The second of them is Peter Bowles, and I want you to hold two facts side by side. On screen, he was Richard DeVere, the supermarket millionaire who buys Grantley Manor. New money, a foreign name he had anglicised for business, a Rolls-Royce on the gravel and an aristocratic widow at the gate treating him as an intruder in a house he had paid for. Off-screen, Peter Bowles' father was a valet, a chauffeur and a butler to aristocratic families. His mother had been a nanny in the Duke of Argyll's household. He was born in London in October 1936 and raised working class in Nottingham, and the two people who brought him up had spent their working lives in service in precisely the sort of house he was now pretending to own. Nobody wrote that into the script. It was simply standing there in the middle of the drawing room every single week, and only he knew. He won a scholarship to RADA and took a prize while he was there and then walked straight into a wall. He was told in as many words that his dark looks meant he would never be cast as an Englishman. So for the best part of 15 years he played villains and foreigners in other people's series. The smooth, well-dressed, faintly dangerous man who turns out to be the problem in the last 10 minutes. If you watched British television in the 1960s, you saw Peter Bowles constantly and almost certainly never learned his name. To the Manor Born ended all that at the age of 43, and the odd thing is that on paper it should not have worked at all. Richard is the straight man. His job is to stand still while Audrey is funny at him in his own hall about his own furniture. A lesser actor plays that as wounded dignity, and the show dies. Bowles found the answer immediately, and it is the reason the programme lasted. He played Richard as a man who is thoroughly enjoying himself. He knows she is being outrageous. He rather likes it. He is faintly delighted by her from the first afternoon, and he is in no hurry whatsoever. Once you can see that in his face, the whole thing tips over from a class war into a love story, which is, of course, what it always was, and why 24 million people sat still for it. And there is a reason it landed as hard as it did, in that particular autumn. The first episode went out on the 30th of September, 1979, 5 months after Margaret Thatcher walked into Downing Street. Britain was in the middle of arguing with itself about exactly this, whether the country belonged to the people who had always had it or to the people who had just gone out and earned it. Every Sunday evening, 20 million people watched that argument conducted between a widow in a headscarf and a grocer in a Rolls-Royce. And the extraordinary thing about Peter Spence's writing is that it refuses to take a side. Audrey is ridiculous, and she is also right about the trees. Richard is vulgar, and he is also the only person keeping the estate alive. Nobody wins, and they get married. There is not a comedy on television now that would have the nerve. He never went short of work again. He was Guthrie Featherstone, the ambitious, slippery QC in Rumpole of the Bailey, for 14 years. He was Major Yates in the Irish RM. He carried Only When I Laugh and Lytton's Diary as a leading man in his own right, and he did all of it while keeping one foot firmly in the West End, in Osborne and Stoppard and Coward and Rattigan, opposite Judi Dench and Michael Gambon, because the theatre was the part of the job he actually loved. There is a lovely stubbornness in the way he lived. He married Susan Bennett in April 1961, when he was 24 and nobody had heard of either of them, and they had 3 children and stayed in one house in Barnes for the rest of it. 61 years married. In 2010, he wrote an autobiography, and the title tells you everything about the man. Ask Me If I'm Happy. Peter Bowles died of cancer in London on the 17th of March 2022. He was 85. Peter Bowles was the son of a butler, and he spent 2 glorious years being told by a lady of the manor that he did not belong in a house like that. The woman who played Audrey's only real friend was, at exactly the same time, being applauded in the West End every night for impersonating the Prime Minister. Third is Angela Thorne, and if you remember one thing about Marjory Frobisher, you remember the loyalty. Marjory is the friend who turns up, listens to Audrey being impossible, says something mild and truthful, and stays anyway. It is the least showy job in the programme and the hardest one to do without vanishing, because the character has to be gentle without being weak. Thorne did it for 3 series and a Christmas special without ever pulling focus, and without ever letting Audrey get away with anything either. She had a beginning nobody would guess from that soft village voice. She was born in January 1939 in Karachi, in what was then British India. Her father was a doctor in the Indian Army and her mother was a teacher, and she spent her first 5 years out there before the family came home to England and a boarding school in West Sussex. She trained at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, and she had a long, solid, unglamorous career behind her before the Manor House ever called. Now the surprise, and it is a genuinely startling one. At the very time To the Manor Born was going out on Sunday evenings, Angela Thorne was on stage at the Whitehall Theatre playing Margaret Thatcher. The play was called Anyone for Dennis? It opened in 1981, the Prime Minister was in office and about as divisive as a British politician has ever been. And Thorne's impersonation was so exact that for a while it became the version the country carried around in its head. She was nominated for an Olivier Award for it. Mrs. Thatcher herself came to see it. Sit with that for a moment. On Sunday, she was the mildest woman in an English village, apologising for the state of her hedge. On Monday, she was the Prime Minister, 8 times a week in the West End. Afterwards, she led sitcoms of her own, Farrington of the F.O. and 3 Up, 2 Down, and kept working steadily right into her 70s in Midsummer Murders and Foyle's War. She married the actor Peter Penry Jones in 1967, and they were together until his death in 2009. Both of their sons went into the business. And if you have watched a British spy drama in the last 20 years, you have seen Rupert Penry Jones on screen without once thinking of Marjory Frobisher. There is one more thing about Marjory worth saying, because it is the sort of detail that only becomes visible when you watch the whole run in order. Marjory is the only character in the programme who never wants anything. Audrey wants her house back. Richard wants to be accepted. Mrs. Pooh wants a wedding. Brabinger wants to be useful. Marjory simply wants her friend to be all right, and she says so approximately never. Thorne built that out of pauses and small looks across a kitchen table, and it is the reason the series has a heart at all. Angela Thorne died at her home in Battersea on the 16th of June, 2023. She was 84. Angela Thorne played the quietest woman in the village and spent her evenings being the most powerful woman in the country. The next one to walk into that lodge kitchen had already taught half the great actors of her century, and not one person watching had the faintest idea. Fourth, and this is my favourite discovery in the whole of this research, is Daphne Heard. She played Mrs. Polovica, Richard's mother, known to everyone as Mrs. Pooh. Small, sharp, foreign-born, entirely unimpressed by money, and the only person in the programme who can see straight through both of the leads at the same time. She likes Audrey on sight. She tells her son to marry the woman roughly 4 years before he manages it. And she takes the biggest laughs in the show without being one of its 2 stars. She was born in Plymouth in August 1904 and christened Delia Phyllis Daphne Heard. She first went on the stage in 1922. So by the time you were watching her make jam in a lodge kitchen on a Sunday night, she had been a working professional actress for 57 years. She was with the Lena Ashwell Players in the 20s. She joined Barry Jackson's company and played the Birmingham Rep and the Malvern Festival. She toured Canada. She went to the Bristol Old Vic, and in 1968 she joined the National Theatre, where she appeared in Laurence Olivier's production of 3 Sisters. And here is the part that made me put my pen down. Between 1955 and 1962, she taught at the Bristol Old Vic Theatre School. Among the students she taught in those 7 years were Peter O'Toole, Brian Blest, and Patrick Stewart. 3 of the most recognisable voices in the English-speaking world learned some of their craft from her. She never made anything of it. There is no interview where she takes the credit. She simply turned up at Television Centre in her 70s and made a nation laugh about pickled cabbage. And the audience had no idea they were watching the woman who had taught Patrick Stewart how to stand still on a stage. She was on screen constantly through the 60s and 70s as well. If a script needed a housekeeper who had been in the house longer than the family had, the call went to her. And it kept going to her for 20 years. Z-Cars Doctor Who, upstairs, downstairs. Always the small woman in the corner who knows where everything is kept. Casting directors understood exactly what she was for, and she never once complained about it. She was 75 when the series began, and she did not get long after it. Daphne Heard died in Bristol on the 22nd of June, 1983, aged 78, a year and a half after the final episode went out. Daphne Heard taught 3 of Britain's greatest actors, and then quietly stole a Sunday night sitcom from underneath 2 of its biggest stars. She was not the only one gone within 2 years, and the man who comes next had a first career you would never in 1,000 guesses connect with him. The 5th of them is John Rudling, and if you loved this programme, you loved Brabinger. He was Audrey's butler, and the joke about Brabinger was that he was very old, very slow, extremely deaf, and completely unshakable. He carried a drinks tray across a room the way other men climb mountains. He arrived with the sherry roughly 1 scene after anybody had asked for it. And he was never once played as a figure of fun at his own expense, because Audrey could not have survived a single episode without him, and both of them knew it perfectly well. That relationship is quietly the warmest thing in the whole series. Audrey has lost her husband, her house, her money, and her position. What she has left is an elderly servant who will not leave, whom she can no longer really afford, and who follows her from the manor to the lodge without being asked and without discussing it. She is rude to him. He ignores it. It is a marriage of a sort, and neither of them would ever admit it. Rudling was born in South Norwood, on the southern edge of London, in August 1907, and he did not begin anywhere near a stage. He trained and qualified as a draftsman, a man at a drawing board working in technical plans and precise lines, and only afterwards turned to acting. He made his real name at the Royal Shakespeare Company, and by the time television found him, he had become one of those faces English drama simply relied on. Turn on a play in the 1960s, and there he was. There is a moment people always mention when they talk about him, and it is not a line, it is the walk. Brabinger crossing a room with a tray is one of the great pieces of physical comedy on British television, and it is entirely built out of restraint. No wobble, no clowning, no bid for a laugh, just an old man moving at the only speed he has left, taking as long as it takes while everybody else in the scene has to wait for him. A younger actor could not have done it, and a lesser one would have overplayed it in the first 10 seconds. Brabinger is the last thing he did that anybody remembers, and it was very nearly the last thing he did at all. He was 72 when the first series was recorded, and he played all 3. On the 18th of December 1983, John Rudling died of respiratory complications, aged 76. Now put those dates together, because they are the hardest fact in this video. The final episode of To the Manor Born went out on the 29th of November 1981. Within 25 months of that night, both Daphne Heard and John Rudling were gone. Mrs. Pooh in the June, Brabinger the following December. The series was still being repeated, it was still one of the best loved things on television. And the audience had absolutely no idea. That is the thing this format keeps teaching me, and I would like to hear from you about it in the comments. Is there a face from a Sunday night programme of your childhood that you simply assumed would always be there? Because half of these people were gone before the video shops had finished stocking the tapes. John Rudling drew technical plans for a living before he became the most beloved butler on British television. And the man who finally married those two off at the end of everything had a brother-in-law whose name is on some of the biggest British films ever made. 6th is Gerald Sim, the rector. The mild, well-meaning, permanently slightly overwhelmed clergyman who has to run a parish that contains Audrey fforbes-Hamilton. Every English village comedy needs this man, and very few of them cast him this well. Sim played him with the exact careful politeness of somebody who worked out years ago that the quickest way through a difficult woman is agreement, and who has never once been thanked for it. He was born in Liverpool in June 1925. He trained at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art and then spent decades doing the thing that almost never makes anyone famous, being completely reliable. What is not remotely obvious from the screen is the company he kept. His sister was the actress Sheila Sim, and Sheila Sim was married to Richard Attenborough. So the gentle rector of Grantley was Richard Attenborough's brother-in-law, and across the years he worked with him again and again, in the films Attenborough acted in and the films he later directed, always somewhere in the middle distance, always exactly right, never the man on the poster. There are British pictures that half the country has seen twice with Gerald Sim standing 4 feet behind the star. It is worth pausing on what a career like that actually is, because our audience knows it better than most. There are perhaps 200 British actors of that generation whose faces every single one of us would recognise instantly and whose names not one of us could produce. They are in the war films and the courtroom scenes and the vicarages. They worked every week of their lives. They were never once out of a job. and they were never once famous. Gerald Sim was one of the very best of them. He married the actress Dame Penelope in 1967, and they were together until she died in 1999. He came back for the 2007 Christmas special, 26 years after the last series, to marry Audrey and Richard's story off properly at last. His final years were spent at Denville Hall in North London, the retirement home founded for actors by actors more than a century ago. And there is something rather lovely about who else was living there at the time. His sister was there, so was his brother-in-law. 3 people who had spent 60 years in the same profession and the same family, ending up in the same house, in the same corridor. Gerald Sim died at Northwood on the 11th of December 2014. He was 89. Gerald Sim was the quiet man at the edge of some of the biggest British films ever made, and hardly anyone ever learned his name. The gardener who barely spoke and who comes next had been carried off a battlefield in North Africa before most of us were born. Before we go on to the last 2, let me put the question of this video back on the table, because it is not really who died and when. It is this. How does a comedy made in 1979 about a widow selling a house, with no swearing in it and no chase scenes, still fill a hotel in Somerset in 2026? Hold that thought, because the answer is standing behind the counter of the village shop, and I will come to her in a few minutes. 7th is Michael Bilton, who played Ned. Ned is the gardener and occasionally the stand-in butler, and he is a very small part measured in lines and a very large one measured in what the programme is actually about. Ned is the estate. He was there before Audrey's husband. He is there after the house is sold. He will be there long after Richard DeVere has gone, and he has no interest whatsoever in who currently owns the lawn he is standing on. Bilton played him with about 11 words an episode and made him the most permanent thing in Somerset. That is a real skill, and it is almost never praised. Half the warmth of an English village comedy comes from the people who are simply always there, holding a rake, saying nothing, proving that the place existed before the plot turned up and will carry on long after it has gone. He was born in December 1919 and educated at Hymers College in Hull. And then the war came for his generation. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant, and he was wounded at El Alamein, the battle in the Egyptian desert that turned the whole North African campaign, and one of the hardest fights the British Army had anywhere in the Second World War. He was carried out of it. He recovered. And then, having survived that, he decided that what he wanted to do with the rest of his life was repertory theatre in the English provinces. He worked constantly for 40 years afterwards, one of those actors whose face sits inside 1,000 hours of British television without ever once being on a poster. And comedy audiences got him back properly near the end. He played Basil in Waiting for God, an elderly gentleman with an extremely lively interest in the ladies of the retirement home, which is about as far from a silent Somerset gardener as it is possible for one man to travel. Think about how many of the faces in the background of British comedy have a story like that sitting behind them. The generation that filled the character parts of the 1970s and 1980s had almost all had a war first, and almost none of them ever mentioned it on a chat show. Ned leans on a spade and says nothing, and the man holding the spade had been shot at in a desert at 22. Michael Bilton died on the 5th of November 1993 at the age of 73. Michael Bilton was carried off the sand at El Alamein and spent the next 50 years making people smile without ever raising his voice. And the woman who ran the village shop has a voice you have almost certainly heard, even if you have never once seen her face. The last of the 8 is Daphne Oxenford, who played Mrs. Patterson, the woman behind the counter of the village shop. The one who knows everything, tells Audrey most of it, and goes on rearranging the tins while she does it. On paper, it is nothing at all. On screen, it is the entire village, because in a comedy about a small place, somebody has to be the small place. Now, if you grew up in Britain between 1950 and 1971, sit down for this one. Every weekday afternoon at 1:45, BBC Radio broadcasts 15 minutes for very young children called Listen with Mother. It opened with a woman's voice asking the audience a question that several generations of British children can still hear inside their heads. Are you sitting comfortably? That voice was Daphne Oxenford. She did it for 21 years from the programme's first day. There is a fair chance that the first voice you consciously remember from outside your own family belonged to the lady in the village shop at Grantley. And there is more. On the 9th of December 1960, a new twice-weekly serial began on ITV about a back street in Salford, and Daphne Oxenford was in the original cast playing Esther Hayes. She was there at the very beginning of Coronation Street, the programme that is still going now, 66 years later. and she came back to it twice in the 1970s. So one woman connects Listen with Mother, the first episode of the longest-running drama on Earth, and a Sunday night sitcom about a manor house. 3 completely different corners of British life, and she is standing in all of them. It is a strange kind of fame being a voice. For 21 years, she was in more British homes every single afternoon than any actress on television, and she could walk into any shop in the country without a soul turning round. She seems to have preferred it that way. She also lent her voice to animation later on, including The Wind in the Willows, so a second generation of children grew up with her without knowing that either. She kept working into her 80s, turning up in The Sweeney in one decade, and dropped The Dead Donkey in the next, and she was still being cast in Midsummer Murders in her mid-80s. She married David Marshall in 1951, and they had 2 daughters, one of whom became a casting director. So a family that began with a voice on the wireless in 1950 was still putting British actors into work 60 years later. And she died on the 21st of December, 2012, at the age of 93. So Denville Hall, the same actors' home where Gerald Sim would spend his own last years 2 years later. Daphne Oxenford put a generation of British children to bed at 1:45, and then sold Audrey fforbes-Hamilton her groceries. So that is all 8 of them. But I promised you at the start that the story behind this programme was stranger than the programme itself. So let me finish it properly. The house is real. Grantley Manor is Cricket House at Cricket St Thomas in Somerset, a Georgian country house with grounds laid out by Capability Brown, where Nelson and Lady Hamilton once stayed. The writer Peter Spence first had the idea years earlier while he was writing gags for BBC Radio after listening to a comedian describe a housewarming party. And the reason he set it in that particular house is the best detail of the lot. His father-in-law owned it. He wrote a comedy about a family losing a great house while married into a family that had one. Since 1999, that house has been a hotel. You can book a room in it. People do, constantly, and they walk into the hall and recognise it in a second, 45 years after 24 million of us watched Audrey come down those stairs. And think about what that final night in 1981 actually was. 17.5 million people sat down to watch a woman marry the man who had bought her house, which meant she got the manor back and got it back on terms nobody in her family had ever managed, by choosing somebody rather than by inheriting something. It is a very old-fashioned ending and a quietly radical one, and it was written by a man whose own wife's family owned the building it was filmed in. Whatever else you say about British television in 1981, it knew how to land a thing properly. And they did finish the story. On Christmas Day 2007, 26 years after the final series, the survivors came back for one more hour, for Audrey and Richard's 25th wedding anniversary. Penelope Keith, Peter Bowles, Angela Thorne and Gerald Sim, standing in those rooms together one last time. It was watched by 10.25 million people on Christmas night, the 6th most watched programme in Britain that week, which for a comedy that had been off the air since 1981 tells you exactly how long this country holds on to the things it loves. And there is one last thing that ought to be said about Peter Spence's writing, because it explains everything above. He never once let anybody in that programme be stupid. Audrey is snobbish, but she is not a fool, and she knows precisely how much trouble she is in. Richard is brash, but he is not a caricature, and he never mocks her for what she has lost. Marjory is gentle and not simple. Brabinger is old and not senile. Mrs. Pooh is foreign and is the cleverest person in the county. Every single one of them is allowed dignity, which is a very rare thing in a comedy about class, and it is why nothing in these 20 episodes has aged badly in 45 years. Cruelty dates. Kindness does not. That is what they left behind. A house that still takes visitors, a joke about class that has never dated, and one line, "Are you sitting comfortably?" That outlived the woman who said it. Which of them do you miss the most? And be honest with me. Was it Brabinger? Tell me in the comments. And if you would like more of these, the subscribe button costs you nothing and helps more than you would think.